They rode tall in the saddle, but they weren't made of steel. On screen, they tamed wild frontiers, stared down outlaws, and carried justice on their shoulders with a six-shooter at their side. In Hollywood's golden age, the Western was king, and being a cowboy was the ultimate test of manhood, a fast track to legend, or so the posters promised. But behind the dust and glory was a harder truth. These men didn't ride into the sunset. They rode onto backlots where scripts were thin, paychecks were smaller than the myths, and stunt work could leave scars that didn't fade. Some actors found stardom, others found typecasting, and many discovered that being the face of the Old West came with a price. For every box office smash, there were forgotten reels. Careers blazed like gunfire, then vanished like smoke. And the cowboy who once ruled the range on screen, he might be fighting for roles in a world that had already moved on. 10 men became the legends of the Western. Only a few walked away larger than life. Stick around, because the real story of Hollywood's cowboys isn't what they filmed on horseback. It's what they left behind when the dust finally settled. Joel McCrea, the reluctant cowboy. Joel McCrea never set out to be Hollywood's cowboy. In fact, he once admitted that he didn't even particularly like acting. What he wanted was a quiet life, some land, and the freedom to raise cattle under the open sky. And yet, fate had other plans. McCrea became one of the most dependable leading men of the silver screen, not because he chased it, but because he embodied it. Where others swaggered, McCrea stood steady. He didn't choose scenery or try to dominate the frame. His power was in restraint. He was the man you believe could stand his ground when the odds turn ugly, not because he shouted the loudest, but because he carried a calm certainty that couldn't be faked. In films like Ride the High Country, 1962, his weathered face told a story all on its own. A man who had lived long enough to know the cost of pride, yet still held to honor when honor was all he had left. Behind the camera, McCrea was the rare star who lived the role he played. While other actors wrapped filming and returned to mansions in Beverly Hills, McCrea went back to his ranch. He rode the same land he had known since boyhood, worked the cattle with his own hands, and seemed to wear the dust of the plains as comfortably as his on-screen persona. By the time he hung up his spurs, McCrea had appeared in over 80 westerns, not because he needed the spotlight, but because the genre needed him. He wasn't the loudest, the flashiest, or the most mythologized cowboy of his era, but he was the one who felt the most real. And in a town built on illusions, Joel McCrea's greatest role was simply being himself. Glenn Ford, the Quiet Storm. Glenn Ford was never the loudest man in a room, but you couldn't look away when he entered it. His strength wasn't in bluster or bravado. It was in the way his eyes shifted, the way his jaw tightened, the way he could hold a silence until it spoke louder than a pistol shot. On screen, Ford wasn't a cowboy who needed to announce his presence. He simply was. In 3:10 to Yuma, 1957, Ford delivered one of the most layered performances in Western history. As outlaw Ben Wade, he was both charming and dangerous, capable of winning a woman's heart in one scene and chilling his captors in the next. He played villains with humanity and heroes with flaws, refusing to let his characters be simple sketches of good or evil. That was Ford's gift. He made the West complicated, the way it truly was. Off-screen, his path was less straightforward. Born in Canada and raised in California, Ford didn't arrive in Hollywood with the larger-than-life swagger of John Wayne or the aristocratic bearing of Gary Cooper. He had to carve out his space slowly, film by film, role by role. And once he found his footing in westerns, he proved that the genre didn't belong only to giants. It also belonged to men who could convey power without shouting, who could win a standoff without firing a shot. Ford's career spanned decades and nearly 100 films, yet he never became as mythologized as some of his contemporaries. Maybe because he made it look too easy. Maybe because his characters were too real to be statues. But for those who know the Western, Glenn Ford was the quiet storm rolling over the plains, steady, relentless, unforgettable. Randolph Scott, the last cowboy standing. Randolph Scott didn't play cowboys. He defined them. For 3 decades, his tall frame and stoic face were as much a part of the American Western as the wide open sky. If John Wayne was the myth, Scott was the template, the model every other cowboy was measured against. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't theatrical. He was solid, unshakable, a figure carved out of the frontier itself. In the 1930s and 40s, Scott worked tirelessly, often in B-movies that churned out one dust-covered adventure after another. Many of those films are forgotten now, but Scott never was. Why? Because he brought a consistency that audiences trusted. They didn't need to ask if the sheriff would stand tall or if the rancher would defend his land. If Scott was in the saddle, you already knew the answer. That quiet certainty became his trademark. And yet, it was late in his career that he reached his peak. Teaming with director Bud Boetticher in the 1950s, Scott stripped away the polish and leaned into something more rugged, more human. Films like Ride Lonesome, 1959, and The Tall T, 1957, revealed a cowboy less mythic and more mortal, still strong, but tempered by loss, weariness, and the kind of wisdom you don't find in youth. He aged into the role like fine leather, weathered but stronger for it. Off-screen, Scott was a man of remarkable discipline. He managed his career with precision, invested wisely, and when he finally stepped away from acting, he left with dignity intact, a rarity in Hollywood. Randolph Scott never needed to shout, never needed to chase the legend. He simply saddled up, did the work, and rode off when the time was right. And for many, he remains the last cowboy truly standing. Alan Ladd, the man who rode away. Alan Ladd wasn't the biggest man in the room. He wasn't towering like John Wayne, nor did he have the rugged weight of Randolph Scott. But when Ladd stepped into the frame, something shifted. He carried a quiet intensity, a kind of haunted presence that made the screen lean in closer. He didn't need size. He had gravity. That presence found its perfect home in Shane, 1953, a film that turned Ladd into more than an actor. It turned him into an icon. As the mysterious gunslinger who rides into a troubled valley, helps a family, and then disappears into legend, Ladd gave Westerns one of their most enduring figures. Children called after him on the dusty trail, "Shane, come back." But the man in buckskin never turned. It wasn't just a line in a script. It was a metaphor for Ladd himself. Behind the scenes, Ladd wrestled with the strange paradox of stardom. He was soft-spoken, almost shy, and he often doubted whether he fit the image that Hollywood tried to project onto him. He was no stranger to insecurity, and yet, in front of the camera, he radiated a strength that audiences believed in wholeheartedly. That contradiction, vulnerability hidden beneath steel, gave his performances their edge. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Ladd didn't flood the genre with dozens of westerns. Instead, he chose carefully, and in doing so, left a smaller but sharper mark. His cowboys weren't mythic giants. They were men you could imagine bleeding, breaking, or walking away from a world they'd fought to protect. Alan Ladd never lingered on screen longer than the story required. He rode in, did what needed to be done, and then vanished into the horizon. And maybe that's why, all these years later, we're still calling after him. John Wayne, the monument. John Wayne wasn't just a cowboy, he was the cowboy. For decades, his silhouette in the saddle was as recognizable as the flag over a courthouse. Towering, broad-shouldered, and unshakable, Wayne became less of a man and more of a monument. The Western wasn't simply a genre he worked in. It was the land he ruled. From Stagecoach, 1939, to The Searchers, 1956, Wayne didn't just play heroes, he played America's idea of itself. Rugged, stubborn, slow to change, but impossible to break. His drawl, his walk, his very presence became part of the country's cultural language. To many, he was the frontier made flesh. To millions of fans, he didn't act the cowboy. He was the cowboy. But monuments come at a cost. The bigger Wayne's legend grew, the harder it became to see the man beneath it. Off-screen, he could be charming, funny, and self-deprecating. He was also deeply aware of the weight of his image, the expectations that every role, every gesture, had to live up to the larger-than-life persona Hollywood had built around him. He wasn't allowed the quiet humanity of Joel McCrea or the shadows that Glenn Ford explored. For Wayne, the screen demanded certainty. It demanded myth. That myth carried him through more than 80 westerns, a staggering record of gunfights, cattle drives, and showdowns across every kind of frontier. And though critics debated his acting range, audiences never doubted his power. When Wayne rode into frame, there was no question who owned the scene. John Wayne wasn't perfect, and he wasn't subtle. But perfection and subtlety were never the point. He was something else entirely, the larger-than-life figure audiences needed him to be. And like the Old West itself, he looms in memory, massive, flawed, unforgettable. James Stewart, The Haunted Plains. James Stewart was never supposed to be a cowboy. With his lanky frame, halting voice, and boyish sincerity, he was the embodiment of the everyman. He was the man you rooted for in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the neighbor you trusted in It's a Wonderful Life. But when Stewart strapped on a gun belt and rode into the West, something remarkable happened. That same warmth became the mask for something darker. In westerns like Winchester 73, 1950, The Naked Spur, 1953, and The Man from Laramie, 1955, Stewart's Cowboys weren't shining heroes. They were wounded men, driven by obsession, anger, and desperation. His voice, so often associated with kindness, took on an edge, trembling not from nerves, but from barely contained fury. He could be tender one moment and terrifying the next, and that unpredictability made his performances electric. This shift wasn't accidental. Stewart had returned from World War II a decorated combat pilot, carrying with him experiences that had carved deep into his soul. Though he never spoke of them openly, those shadows seeped into his Western roles. You could see it in his eyes, the weight of loss, the memory of violence, the ache of something broken that could never fully be repaired. On screen, Stewart brought that hidden storm to the wide-open plains. He made the Western psychological. No longer just stories of good men and bad men, but fractured souls wandering landscapes as harsh inside as they were outside. His characters weren't just fighting bandits or rustlers, they were fighting themselves. James Stewart didn't reinvent himself as a cowboy. He revealed the cowboy as something more than a stock hero. He showed us the haunted plains where justice and vengeance often blurred. And in doing so, he proved that even the everyman could cast a long, unsettling shadow. Robert Taylor, the gentleman out west. Robert Taylor never quite looked like he belonged in the dust and grit of the frontier. With his polished features, dark hair, and matinee idol looks, he was built for tuxedos, romances, and the glittering world of MGM melodramas. And yet, when Hollywood strapped a holster to his waist and set him against the wide horizon, Taylor proved that a cowboy didn't have to be rough-hewn to command the screen. He could be elegant and still deadly serious. In Westward the Women, 1951, Taylor played a trail boss leading a wagon train of brides-to-be across treacherous land. It wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story of grit beneath charm, of a man who seemed too refined for the dust but revealed steel beneath the polish. Time and again, Taylor surprised audiences by blending a certain aristocratic dignity with the toughness the Western demanded. Unlike some of his peers, Taylor didn't dominate the genre with dozens of titles. But the ones he chose carried weight. He was never the loudest cowboy, nor the most mythologized, but he brought something unique, an authority that didn't need to come from sheer size or gravel-voiced menace. His power was in control, in the way he moved through chaos without breaking composure. Off-screen, Taylor carried himself much the same way, impeccably groomed, soft-spoken, yet fiercely determined in his career. He managed to walk the line between Hollywood's glossy studio image and the grit of the Western frontier, a balancing act few stars could maintain. Robert Taylor may not be the first name people recall when they think of old Hollywood cowboys, but he remains one of its most fascinating contradictions. He was the gentleman who rode west, proving that even in the dust and danger of the frontier, elegance could survive. Gary Cooper, the man who stood alone. Gary Cooper didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to swagger or grandstand. His power was in silence, in the way he could let a pause linger, in the way his eyes spoke more than a page of dialogue ever could. He wasn't the cowboy who blazed across the frontier with fire and fury. He was the man who stood, who endured, who shouldered the weight no one else would. That essence came to its purest form in High Noon, 1952. As Marshal Wilkane, Cooper played a lawman abandoned by his friends, deserted by his town, yet still choosing to face danger alone. The film unfolds in real time, each tick of the clock pushing him closer to a showdown he cannot escape. Cooper's performance isn't one of bravado, it's one of quiet resolve. His face, lined with worry and weariness, tells the story of a man who knows fear but refuses to run from it. It wasn't just a role. It was an image of courage that resonated with audiences far beyond the theater. Cooper became the embodiment of the Western ideal, not invincible, not perfect, but unwavering when it mattered most. Off-screen, Cooper's life mirrored that simplicity. He was known for his reserved nature, preferring the quiet of the outdoors to the flash of Hollywood parties. He often seemed like a man slightly out of place in the industry, too sincere, too unpolished for the glitter of the studio system. Yet that very authenticity was what made him magnetic. Gary Cooper's cowboys weren't just characters. They were moral compasses, reminders of what it meant to stand firm in the face of doubt. In a world-chasing spectacle, Cooper proved that the truest strength is found in stillness. He wasn't just a star of westerns. He was their conscience. Audie Murphy, the soldier in the saddle. Audie Murphy's story was unlike any other in Hollywood. He didn't come to the Western through studios, stage schools, or a carefully groomed career. He came straight from the battlefield. One of the most decorated American soldiers of World War II, Murphy returned home with medals that told stories no one wanted to relive, least of all him. He was small in stature, barely over 5.5 feet, but his courage had been proven beyond question. Hollywood didn't quite know what to do with him at first. He didn't have the commanding size of John Wayne, nor the aristocratic air of Gary Cooper. But when they put a cowboy hat on him and handed him a six-shooter, Murphy brought something no acting coach could teach: authenticity. His westerns carried an edge of reality, a gravity that came from a man who had truly seen danger face to face. In films like Destry, 1954, and No Name on the Bullet, 1959, Murphy carved out a unique space. His characters were often quiet, sometimes even understated, but beneath that calm surface was a man you believe could act decisively when the moment demanded. He didn't need to posture or grandstand. His presence alone was enough to suggest danger held in reserve. Off-screen, Murphy wrestled with the challenges of adjusting to civilian life, yet he continued to work, making more than 40 films, most of them westerns. For audiences, he represented something rare: a cowboy whose toughness wasn't an invention of the screen. It was lived. Audie Murphy may not have been Hollywood's tallest cowboy or its most mythic, but he was, in many ways, its most genuine. The man in the saddle wasn't just playing a role. He was carrying the weight of truths few dared to imagine. Henry Fonda, the two faces of justice. Henry Fonda had a face made for the Western. Lean, angular, weathered by nature rather than artifice, it was the kind of face you believe had squinted into the sun over endless plains. On that face, justice seemed to rest naturally. He was the lawman who stood tall when others faltered, the pioneer who endured the hardships of the land. In My Darling Clementine, 1946, his Wyatt Earp was calm, steady, and upright, a portrait of integrity framed against the dusty streets of Tombstone. But Fonda's genius was that he wasn't confined to one side of the story. He could wear the white hat of virtue as easily as he could slip into the shadows. When he turned villain in Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, 1968, audiences were stunned. This was the man who embodied decency, now gunning down innocents with eyes as cold as steel. The betrayal of expectation was precisely what made it unforgettable. Fonda showed that justice and cruelty could inhabit the same figure, and that the Western was big enough for both. Off-screen, Fonda was as complex as the roles he played. Known for being reserved, sometimes even distant, he approached his craft with a quiet intensity. He wasn't interested in the trappings of stardom. He was interested in truth. Whether that truth came in the form of a steadfast marshal or a merciless outlaw, he delivered it with the same precision. Henry Fonda's Cowboys remind us that the West wasn't just a struggle between good and evil. It was a place where the same man could embody both, sometimes in the same breath. And in that duality, Fonda didn't just play the West. He revealed its soul. The old Hollywood cowboy was more than a character. He was a symbol of grit, of principle, of the unshakable spirit that built the myth of the American frontier. Each man who wore the hat and holstered the gun brought something different to the saddle. Joel McCrea gave us quiet authenticity. Glenn Ford showed us the storm beneath still waters. Randolph Scott embodied the steady hand of tradition, while Alan Ladd left us with a haunting farewell in Shane. John Wayne towered like a monument, larger than life, and James Stewart revealed the haunted shadows beneath the hero's surface. Robert Taylor carried elegance into the dust. Gary Cooper became the conscience of the West. Audie Murphy rode with the truth of lived courage, and Henry Fonda showed us that justice could wear two faces. Together, they weren't just actors in costumes. They were the men who carried the Western on their shoulders, shaping a genre that defined a generation of cinema. Their legacies remind us that even in a world of shifting stars and changing tastes, the image of a lone rider against the horizon will always hold power. And now, I want to hear from you. Which of these cowboy legends left the deepest mark on you? Is there one you feel doesn't get the recognition he deserves? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read and answer them all. If you enjoyed this journey through Hollywood's frontier, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a ride. I post videos daily, diving into the myths, legends, and untold stories of the golden age of cinema. Thanks for watching, and until next time, may the trail always lead you to a good story.